And so it's important that, you go and do that due diligence through the pre-meeting with the council or get hands on that local council regulations as to, is there any divergence from what the council wants to happen in their own particular areas versus what the res code is saying. Hello and welcome to another episode of Helpmebuy Property Podcast. And today we are going to talk about pre-acquisition property development due diligence. Now, before I get into all of that, let me introduce my beautiful co-host, drum rolls, Cheryl. How are you today, Cheryl?
I am awesome, Moxin, as always, and always so much fun to be here. I am so pumped about what we're going to be talking about today because it's stuff that we all have to do every time we look at development sites, which is due diligence.
Yes. And it's all about, what to look out for before you put the pen to the paper, right? This is about, sometimes even you've put the pen to the paper and, you have a due diligence clause in there. And what are the key things to look out for? It's those moments where, the site is too good to be true. And, you've done the numbers, you've crunched the numbers, you've done the feasibilities and the numbers make sense. But this is all about ticking the boxes, making sure that what are the implications? Can this actually be done, right? And let's start off with a story, right? Before we go into a lot of detail. I was reading, one of the group posts today. And so this guy was basically talking about, hey, I have a house, the council has refused to allow me to put a duplex at the back. And I was like, wait a minute. Where did the due diligence go? Why didn't you do the due diligence to know that council would not allow you to build two duplexes at the back? And so, how did that happen? Like, where was the leakage, right? That's naturally what my thinking was. And so you hear these stories where, people settle on the projects, buy the projects without doing proper due diligence, and then finding out bad things, right? Finding out things that can impact the profitability of the site or a development site.
There's a real, again, fine line because, you don't want to get to a point where you get paralysis analysis where you're like, you're almost like an investigator where you're almost looking for things that to make it a deal breaker, but yet you don't want to do too little due diligence as well. One of my favorite examples is not really a favorite because it didn't turn out so well, but it's a good example of, yes, there's a level of due diligence that you can do when you tick off things. However, it's also what I have found, it's not what you know, but also who you know as well when it comes to due diligence, because there are things that are not everyone will know about a particular site, and it might be very, very specific where it might be something the neighbor knows or something that your consultant knows or something. So I think there's an incredible, sometimes it's a bit of luck as well. It is incredibly valuable to really build that network, build the connections that you have, because there might be something in the works. Okay, so a good example would be actually a part of the networking event that we had in the Sunshine Coast last month. So a few of the developers there were talking about a specific area, and they said, and it's only when you've put in your application and you're in the DA process that council in a particular area, this was sort of Landsborough, actually has a flood overlay, which you can't find anywhere else. Like, there's nothing that you can't find it on council's website or whichever. And so there were two developers who said, yes, that's absolutely right, because the planners at the time say, yeah, no, you can't find anything on our website because it's, we're sort of backdating it or whichever. And so it's that sort of level of, you can't do us an extent unless you know someone who's developed there, unless you know another planner, an independent planner that's hit that sort of hurdle before, you wouldn't have picked that up during your normal public DD. So I think there's a certain level of, this is how much tick you tick.
there is this question that I always ask myself is how much is too much, when you talk about extensive nature of the due diligence, right? And again, I might be the most biased person when it comes to due diligence because I'm always one of those people who would overdo versus underdo when it comes to due diligence. I remember probably like about 8 months ago, I said no to a site where I had spent close to $10,000 on all the surveys and the arborist and everything. And the only reason I walked away was because of that particular tree where arborist was pretty sure that the tree can go, and the council would not just confirm that the tree would go. And that tree, if was there, would break the site completely. And so there was no profit in the site if the tree was there. And we chased the council, and we were in the due diligence period. And the last final wording was that I spoke to the council arborist. I still remember. He confirmed to me over the phone. He said, "Moss, I can tell you the tree can go, but I cannot put it in writing until I've gone through the site and seen through. Basically, based on what you're telling me, I can say that the tree can go, right?" And I was like, should I take a punt and do this? Or should I just walk away and cough up the $10,000 that I've spent? And I walked away from the deal. And funnily enough, like 3 weeks later, he responded saying, "Hey, the tree can go." But it's one of those things, right? That you're like, okay, that's fine. I'll find something better. This is what I'll write off to the experience. I'll write off to better time management. I'll write off to something else. But I would rather take these small hits than a big hit in the future, right?
Yeah, exactly. It could have gone either way. He could have said, actually, we wouldn't have been...
It's a coin flip, right? Basically.
It really is. But I guess it's the point that it's a big reminder, right? It's that to have a mindset of abundance as well, to be able to say, yeah, that's one side I lost, but then I'll get another one. So, and to not be hung up about it, because this is the thing with due diligence, 9 out of 10 sites will not stack for whatever reason. So if you manage to hit the financial feasibility and it ticks that, but then you've got due diligence that, something comes up, then, move on to the next one. We say again, if it was that easy, everyone would be doing it. So maybe let's highlight some of the key types of due diligence that we can do on a site and what are the essential ones. And then we can talk about some of the more rarer ones that are more specific to particular areas, because not every area will be affected by, mining and all sorts of things. So maybe over to you. You can highlight a few of your favorite ones.
I think the good segue is definitely trees. I think the first thing that I always look onto sites, and I know that there are green councils who are very pedantic about, weeds that they call trees, and then there are other councils who are a lot more understandable on, getting rid of some of the trees. But, there is a distinction between high, medium, and low retention trees, and majority of the councils that I've come across would always say that, the higher and the medium sometimes retention trees needs to stay. And so how do you navigate the site through? The most important one when it comes to trees that a lot of people don't think about is the tree protection zones. And so every tree has its own protection zone where you can't do much around it. You can have a permeable path or something, but you can't build anything in that tree protection zone. The interesting bit is this. If there is a tree on a neighboring property and it's even not a high retention tree, it's a medium or even a low retention tree, and its protection zone comes into your property, then because it's their tree and you can't take it down, you can't build. And so it becomes a very interesting conversations in a lot of these places where, you might have a funny neighbor, who might not be able to work with you or is not ready to let the tree go because of some of these things. And so while you're checking out trees on your own site, it's always important to see what's sitting on the boundaries of the property, especially, the side boundaries, especially if you're doing like a 4-unit site or a 3-unit site where you would have, houses lined up, back of the houses lined up to one side of the property. And see as to what is at those fences. Is there any major trees that would impact your TPZs? And put a solution-focused hat as to, okay, how does this go about? How do you go about, finding a solution to that? And same goes with the easements, right? So, people always look at easements to their own properties, but you need to also look at easements to the neighboring properties and see how does that impact yourself. How close can you come to the easements as well? There's always issues around, the offsets and setbacks when it comes to easements, and you can't put plants or you can't have landscaping, very close to the easements as well. So those are two of my favorites. Every time I look at the site, I would basically start off there. What about you?
Trees and easements. So yeah, apart from that, bushfire. So depending on where you're building, bushfire is a big one. Obviously looking at flooding. Bushfire doesn't necessarily mean, I know that when we were doing lots of land subdivisions up in Sydney, in the hills area, so there would be particular bushfire zones, and that would affect the zoning. And the zoning would mean that, one block might be low density, where another block might end up being what they call E4, environmental living, which meant that you have to have community titles, which meant that you had to have larger lots. And it meant that, there are particular APZs, which is asset protection zones for bushfires. So it didn't mean necessarily that you couldn't build in it, but it does mean that if there's properties that are within, depending on different bushfire bands, so they call it BAL, BAL, so that you've got your fire zone,
bushfire attack level.
Yeah, 29 and all these different bands, depending on if your house, if you're building a property. So whoever it is that ends up buying that particular property that you subdivided, that particular property actually becomes a bit of a lesser value, because not everyone is going to want to build in a bushfire zone, because it affects the build price. It tends to be more expensive. There tends to be a little bit of a slope as well. So it makes it a little bit less desirable. So it's just being able to say, when you're doing your due diligence and you're pricing up your lots, if you're building in a bushfire zone, that the lots that are affected by bushfire BAL ratings may be valued a little bit less as well.
Yeah. And bushfire zones are interesting. I think it also impacts the landscape side of things too. So when you have the landscape plans in a bushfire zone, councils would always talk about big canopy trees that do not overhang the house. And so you need to ensure that while the council is persistent about you having, say, for example, X amount of trees on the house or on the lot, when you're building a particular site, they might want you to not overhang, which means that you are using a lot more pus in relation to, providing for that landscape. So it's interesting, how some of these overlays overlap with each other, right? So the other one that you mentioned is the flood ones. That's an interesting one as well.
Yeah, we know, especially with areas in terms of New South Wales and Queensland, which had some pretty big floods recently, in the last year, where they might not have had flooding in those areas, then we've got floods now. So wherever it is that you're looking to develop, make sure you do your due diligence as to where the flood zones are. I think it also helps to be able to give insurance companies a call to see their thoughts around, are they insuring houses in those areas? Have the premiums gone up recently? If so, why? So these are just part of the everyday things, because people are more aware of flooding these days, and particularly if you're going into a new area, which at the moment, if it's nice and sunny and there's no flooding, then it looks all nice and bright. And you've got the locals, you're a newbie coming into a new area where you're like, oh, it looks fantastic. It's flat here. There's a nice little creek down the road. It's fantastic for lifestyle. And then the locals are like, they don't know that it's flood affected. Yes. So again, doing that sort of due diligence, but talking to the neighbors, knowing that you have a local team that understand the area, I think you're going to get a lot of really good intel from that aspect.
And again, I think flood zones are the same, right? It's not that you can't build on the flood zones. There are ways that, you can raise up the level and, put the sites on the pegs and, do the build. I think the tricky bit in Melbourne is getting the Melbourne Water to sign off on the flood zone. And so a lot of people think about the flood zones on the site on its own. But if there is a flood zone at the front of the property, and if it overlays, say, for example, your driveway, or the pathway that you're going to build in, and naturally, your stormwater doesn't work because there would be a pool of water if it's under the flood zone. Those requirements are very stringent. And so while the council might have no issues from you building that, the water authority might not allow you. And so the council will be like, well, we don't care. You just go ahead and build, just convince these people, to do the build. And that's where it becomes really interesting. And so that's why, knowing all the right consultants and making sure that, you're seeking the right approvals up front, Melbourne Authority approval, for example, or City West Water, whoever that you go with, depending on where you are in Victoria, only costs about $400. It takes about 2.5 weeks for them to come back and provide you with an advice. But, it's one of those where, you might think that everything works, but as soon as you go down the route of civil, the planning approval would work okay. As soon as you go down the path of civil, you would realize that the building approval is where you would get stuck. So it's interesting on a lot of these things.
Yeah, over to you. I think we're going to ping pong on our favorite due diligence items.
What else? I would say the other one, which is quite interesting, is the local council rules. Now, again, when you're talking about the due diligence side of things, everyone talks about the risk code. And majority of the people, or majority of the architects or the draftees know the risk code because they've been operating in that industry for a very long time. But especially in Victoria, because there is no CDC per se, where you can fast track your application, every now and then you would find that local councils have their own guidelines from a development perspective, which basically supersedes a lot of the risk code requirements. And so it's important that, you go and do that due diligence through the pre-meeting with the council, or get hands on that local council regulations as to, is there any divergence from what the council wants to happen in their own particular areas versus what the risk code is saying. Okay. For example, I'll give you a typical example. One of the sites that we have in Diamond Creek that is, about to be kicked off through the build side of things, there are various different garden precedents available in the area, and every garden precedence allows how much is the build limit. Is it a low density? Is it a medium density? And so while the zones define that as well, within the zone, they would have these garden precedents overlapping the normal zones of the normal zones of the state, and the garden precedents overlapping between the two of them. And so it becomes really, really important to understand what council needs and what council requirements are on some of these things. A typical example also with this is, when you talk about zones and the council regulations, is, for example, a high density zone, which is an RGZ zone in Melbourne, you could potentially do a high rises there. Okay. A lot of people think that just because I can do a high rise there, I can do townhouses because, that's still medium density. Some councils may allow you, and some councils would say, no, we don't want townhouses here. We want a high rise here. And I've come to a few of these examples where the council is persistent that, it's an RGZ zone and we want a high rise, we don't want townhouses there. And so while from a person's perspective, they were thinking about building 5 or 6 townhouses there of a bulky nature, all of a sudden the council shoots you down and say, well, this is an underdevelopment, and they actually want an overdevelopment in an area like that. And so it's important to understand some of these intricacies. And, some of these things are not written rules. Some of these things are, rules set up by the person who's setting up the game, right? So you need to play by their rules. You can't just follow the rules that everyone else is following.
And often that might, you'll be able to find that in sort of like, there might be a precinct master plan where they've said, we actually want high density here because we want to have a train station, we want to have a shopping center. And so we need to have these sorts of larger, higher density living because we have to support all this extra infrastructure that we're putting in as well, and all these extra services, which is a good segue into another point, which is services. So your in terms of stormwater, in terms of sewer, all that side of things. Services, when I was dealing with areas, one of the key things to be aware of is that there, especially when in greenfield areas, like water may not be ready in time for when your subdivision is completed, or the sewer pipe has not been laid to get to that point. So it's really important as well, especially if you're working in greenfield areas, not so much in brownfield, because there's barely established, but you've got to make sure there's sufficient capacity in established areas for you with sufficient capacity. In greenfield, you've got to make sure that it's there, because it might be zoned for development. You might technically be able to develop it. However, you might not have, like, the council and the area might not actually have sufficient services to your development for it to actually be delivered. So what it might be is, like, say, for example, with Sydney Water at the time, they said, we have sufficient capacity for 1,500 homes, right, for this area. And so you actually have to look at the development pipeline to see whether if you put a development application in, if your property and your project is going to fall within that 1,500 lots. Because if it's not, then you could be waiting another 5 years. And so from that aspect, you've got to know the way of which way to go from that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment that you make here, right? Because I remember looking at the site probably about a year ago now, where everything was a tick, and I was going through, the civils, and I was like, wait a minute, where is sewer? I can't find, and this is established area we're talking about, right? I was like, where is sewer? I can't find any sewer diagrams. And so I called the architect, and he's like, yeah, that's weird. Where is sewer? And so I was 100% sure that it was a software error because it wasn't showing up. And so we requested the plans, and apparently that particular area didn't have sewer. It was just stormwater tanks, those discharge, those tanks, those septic tanks, that was going in there. And I was like, wow, okay.
Empty it out.
Yeah. And this was like a small pocket in a well-established area where there was sewer everywhere, just that small pocket that didn't have any sewer. And I was like, wow, this is just so interesting. Like, you can't assume anything these days, right?
And that's why you've got to do your due diligence to tick the key boxes to say, yep, okay. Because if I'm not wrong, there's a fee that you've got to pay for that service of the truck.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, you can get some of these through Dial Before You Dig. Some of those reports basically can come through there. But some of the detailed ones, like, legal point of discharge, you're talking about Melbourne Water Approval or Water Authority approvals, etc. You would have to pay some fees to basically get those plans from the council. I think the best person who's your friend is when you are doing some of these due diligence around civil is, of course, a land surveyor, right? They would have access to a lot of these things on their fingertips. And so they would know who to reach out to, when to reach out to. And so having them on retainer while you're looking at some of these things is quite important and quite the key. I think a lot of people depend only on the architect, and they forget that a lot of these things are not architect related. And so while architect has a big place in, property due diligence or property development due diligence and feasibilities, some of these things are out of their reach. They don't understand civils. Typical architects don't understand civils. They don't understand a lot of these things. And so they can point you in the right direction, but they might not be the right person to provide you some of this advice.
Cool. Now over to you. I picked one, you pick another one.
My next one would be potentially precedences in the area. And look, there are so many things that you can consider. Let's talk about slopes first. I think we haven't really talked about slopes. Let's talk about slopes. I think slope is an important one.
So my question is it good that the slope goes up, or is it good that the slope goes down?
Well, the slope should always go down against the property, right? That's what my understanding is. That's how I've been trained and taught. that, should always come towards the street level rather than going away from the street level, so that you can work with the stormwater and you don't need to have those water pumping pits at the end of the property pushing the water up, or you're looking for a legal point of discharge at the end of the property, fighting with the neighbor. So it's always important that it's sloping, towards the street. That's key rule number one. That's where it all starts. Number two, naturally people think that, slope is bad, right? So 1 meter slope, 2 meter slope, people will walk away from the sites. And yes, generally that rule of thumb works. But it's also important to understand that the bigger the site becomes, the easier it is to work with a bigger slope, right? You can build along the lines of the slope. And so, for example, a 2 meter slope on a 500 square meter block or a 300 square meter block is massive, but a 2 meter slope on a 4,000 square meter block is not massive. You can work with that slope. It's quite easier from that perspective. Also, it also depends on your structural engineer, how he works with the slope, because, one of the things people get scared from the slope is the build cost that it's going to cost, be it the retaining walls, the retention, etc., all of those things, right? So it's important that how does your structural engineer works through some of these things? And again, this is not the part of due diligence typically, but when you're costing out through the feasibility side of things, a slope would generally add a bit of more to the contingency side of things too. Okay, but that doesn't mean that a flat site is an easier site. I have two sites right now. One is pretty slopey site where the civils are quite low, versus another site which looks quite flat, but the civils are very, very high.
And why is that?
Well, the civils are high because the bore piers that are going in the other sites are just millions. I'm just exaggerating, but there is a lot of them. Whereas the site with the slope, they've worked through the site in such a way that, it's a stepped house, and, it's not causing a lot of retaining walls, etc. Both of them are corner lots. So while the site remains quite flat, the site neighboring those are quite high and deep, are high and, wide. And so, you have to provide retaining for some of those sites as well. So it's interesting as to how you look at slopes, and they play a really, really big part on the stormwater discharge, on the building side of things, on the slope, on the retaining walls, and the building cost, and all of these things comes into play when you're looking through the slope.
You raise a point, Moss, around, the pierings, because it also depends on the type of soil and if you've got rock in an area, right? Because if you've got a rocky area, which means hopefully you've got a more solid foundation, and that means you won't have to peer down as far. However, if you've got something that's pretty sandy and not as solid, then you're going to have piers that's right enter and pretty deep. So doing some due diligence and understanding the type so that you can factor in. So if you're again, as the developer, if you're building, if you're not building, then maybe you don't have to worry. Some of that's someone else's problem. But if you're building something, then you're going to have to want to know, well, I'm going to have to account for how much contingency for peering do I need to account for? Is this sufficient? Is it going to be sufficient as well? I think that's something that's quite important, especially when you're getting quotes from builders, whether you're doing a townhouse or a house. And if you know that a particular area doesn't, needs quite a bit of peering, and they've quoted you on something that you look and you sort of go, I'm not quite sure that's enough, then you want to make sure that you've got a bit of contingency in your feasibility.
Yes, definitely. Over to you. What's your next one?
I've got a second one. Okay, excellent. I wanted to talk about mining overlays and mine subsidence. I'm not sure if you get a lot of that in Victoria. Probably not.
No, I think Adelaide, a few. You get a lot of mining ones, and what is it? Arrays? No, quarries. Quarries. So you get a lot of them in Adelaide. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So mining's a fairly big thing in New South Wales, particularly in areas like Hunter Valley, Newcastle, Wollongong. So it's something where you need to be aware of what they call mine subsidence, and you do need to get clearance, a report, obviously, and if there is a level of mine subsidence, to understand how does that impact your development in terms of building. Because what happens is with mines, and not that I'm an expert in this, but I have looked at sites with mine subsidence. What it could be is that there's mining that's happened underneath a particular area previously, and that mine might actually be dormant, so there's subsidence, right? But what actually means is that there's any development that happens on top, there is a good chance that there might be some settling of the land.
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few things that need to be taken into account, like in terms of what you're building, the types of building that you put onto it in terms of foundations and all that are going to be a little bit different if it hasn't settled. And also insurance. There's a big insurance companies don't like to insure houses that are on mining or on mines as well. I've come across sites where there may be a dormant mine, but I've actually had to ring up the mining company, which had the license over it, just to sort of go, hey, are you guys planning to be doing anything in the next few years? And they've said, yeah, well, we're not doing anything at the moment, but it's there just in case. So we don't actually know when we're going to give it the sign off, when we're actually going to be using it. But at the moment, and if that's the case, then effectively you can't do anything until that mine, basically that's been cleared for active use. So that is something. I mean, in terms of, again, New South Wales, where a lot of that activity does happen, particularly in the outskirts, to be aware of, and the impact of that on developments as well.
And there is some contamination that tends to happen through with the soil as well, isn't it? Where it was previously a mining site, and I just recently read somewhere where while they've given a sign off, you had to get a sign off from the land contamination and the compaction reports, etc., to ensure that the land is clean and clear, and so there is a cost involved with a lot of those things as well.
Yeah, and contamination. If you're purchasing a land that's been farming, any sort of manufacturing, any light industry,
gold mining,
you want to get contamination reports, because if it's a farm and if you've got animals, or especially if you've got vegetables as well, and if they've used pesticides, that stuff needs to be cleaned out. And you have no idea, the things that farmers hide in the middle of their 100 acre properties. There's something suspect somewhere, right? And so contamination reports, the geotech reports, will bring these things up, and you've got to take into account that you've got to remediate those areas.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. My turn?
Oh yes, over you too.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about things that can be moved, but it's good to know about, right? And they are things like electricity poles, bus stops, stormwater pits. And so it's good to know from a due diligence perspective, and they can move, or even those zebra crossings, or all of these things. So they can be moved, but it's good to know, and it's good to put a tick against it that they can be moved to a right place, right? So
I haven't moved a bus stop before, so
yeah, same as me. Look, I've met a few people who have been caught by bus stop. I was fingers crossed. I was lucky where there was a zebra crossing near a school, and I didn't have to move it. I was just bypassing it by a little bit, and so the traffic guy said, "Hey, this is all good."
Why did the zebra cross the road?
Yeah, I was like, is it not just black and white lines that I can draw 2 feet away?
Can I just white out this area and then just move it up here?
Yeah, that's it. I bring some black paint and paint it on the road, and just...
People won't know. They just follow the black and white lines.
That's it.
The lollipop person will be very upset, because they'll be like, where are my lines gone?
Well, the simpleton me, that's what I thought would be the case. But of course, it does take a lot more than that in moving the bus stop and moving these lines and moving the stormwater and the electricity poles. And so it's always important to understand where is the driveway going to go for a particular development, and if there is an electricity pole, and if you're going to move it, then how much it's going to cost X, Y, and Z. And that particular service would be able to move it, right? Majority of the times they are, it's just that, you haven't allowed for some of these costs. It's very rare where a service might come back and say, hey, we can't move it. But it's always good to pick up a phone and just, have a check or, and seek some advice around some of these things. It's very quick and dirty.
Yeah, often it will be, we can move it. It will cost you. Ding.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so it eats away your contingency, right? And they are not cheap to move. You're talking about, $10,000, $20,000 for moving a bloody electricity pole. And so, yeah. It's always fun. It's always fun. At least watching them is always fun. So
yeah, I haven't, like I said, I haven't moved a bus stop, and I'm assuming then that you'd need, if you were to have to move it, there'd be traffic reports of all sorts that you've got to have in place. You've got to get council's input. You've got to have a really good reason as to why you're moving it, and so on. And
the implications it would have, right? The implications, if you're moving electricity pole, you might have to cut off or provide a secondary option. And so, yes, there is a lot of overlaps that happens with a lot of these things, right? I think traffic is an interesting one because, not only do you have to get the traffic reports, sometimes there is traffic management that comes into place on a lot of these things too, right? One of the things, I never do pick up a site ever on a main road, especially a development site over a main road, because, with everything else together, there is this traffic management that comes into place, and these lollipop people are not cheap. I tell you, these people in, red and,
they get paid a good lot of money to stand there and go, dunk, dunk. All right. Yeah. What did we go to university for? Did he have to get a university degree to do that?
I don't think so. I think you just have to look pretty these days to hold one of those.
I tried that as well. I tried looking pretty. I don't get it.
You didn't hit the bar, Cheryl.
What are you talking about? Oh my goodness, I've been publicly shamed. That's it.
But look, I mean, it does cost a lot of money. People don't tend to think about some of these, traffic side of things. And yeah, if it's 6 months worth of, traffic management that you have to allow for, and, even if you're allowing for, $100, $150, $200 worth of one person coming in for 4 hours or 3 hours or 2 hours, it just adds up quite significantly. And so traffic does play a big role. Again, as part of the due diligence, no one really goes into traffic details per se. And a lot of times people look at traffic reports more from a visitor's parking perspective or turning points, etc. And they come in really late in the process. And so while it's important, it's one of those things where, would it break a site? No, traffic is usually where you would find solutions to move things around. That's what I've always, felt. But it's also important to understand that, if there is traffic management involved, which is different to the traffic reports, you just need to allow for those big contingencies coming in place, right?
Yeah. And if you have larger sites where it is going to impact on the significantly on the number of people and number of residents that are going to be introduced into a particular area, council is going to be really interested in your traffic reports and where the traffic going into your development and the traffic that's going out of your, new community, where they're turning circles and things like that, visibility of traffic that's coming through, traffic lights, that sort of thing.
There is whole of traffic surveys that they do, right? On one of the sites that I did, they basically sat there for almost 2 weeks, measuring how many people, how many small cars and large cars pass through this particular point, and what time of the month and what time of the day. And so they use that, especially, in one of the weekend cases, where, people were complaining, oh, you're building 8 here and, you're only providing 2 and everyone has 4 cars these days. And, it's a small gully. Yeah. And so when you see people going with tick, basically, that's what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. Yes.
Again, do you need a university degree for that?
I think for traffic reports maybe, but I don't think that the
To do
person
the
there
report,
with the
yes.
clicker. Yeah. Person with the clicker, no, I don't think so. I think you just need a thumb, you just need to ensure that you have a
To
thumb.
be really good at thumb wars, that's part of the qualification. Like, how good are you at thumb wars, and how
I think my
quickly
6-year-old would do wonders.
are they legally allowed to do that? I reckon we should do that. Put our children out there with their little. Either way, I digress. How many more should we go through? Another 2 or 3 more, and
Yes, I think that we can stop. I can kick off on the next one, which is quite favorite of mine, which is precedences. And I'm going to take your turn here. Everyone talks about precedences and they say, hey, check out the precedents in the area and see what's allowed for. Okay. While it's important, here is the stereotype that I'm going to break it out for people. Okay. While the precedences are important, from council's perspective, they are irrelevant. Councils don't care what's happening to the next door property or the property across the road or what's happened previously to properties, similar property down the road. Every case that goes to the council is assessed independently. And so there has been instances, and I have my own personal experience, where a neighboring property has been approved by the council 2 years ago, and the same policies would not apply to the next door property because the council has changed. Then now their local guidelines have changed, or there is a new planner, who is a greenies fan, and, they want a jungle in the backyard. So again, the precedences, while they're important, sometimes, you can't just depend on them when you're doing these due diligences. What's your experience been, Cheryl?
Yeah, and I agree. I totally agree. I look around at the precedents, but I don't necessarily 100% say that's all I can do. I think that you need to be able to push the envelope a little bit. And I've seen, we've done it in our projects before, where you speak to council and actually they want a little bit more density, or they want some gentrification in the particular areas. So they'll give you a little bit more leeway. I've seen developments where everyone thought they could only build three-level townhouses, and a developer bought a really small site, but was able to put units on it, 3-level units, which no one else did at the time. So, being really smart with design and so on and so forth. So, yes, precedents use it as some level of a guide, and, have a really good planner and architect who will sort of push the boundaries a little bit. I'd rather sort of say this is the best case scenario, what I want to achieve, and have council sort of pull it back.
Yes, it's always the case.
Rather than be too conservative as well, and potentially miss out on some extra GRV. So yeah, I think it's a good guide. I think it's safe. However, don't be afraid to push the boundaries a bit as well.
100%. I don't think that I can add more. Over to you.
Thank you.
Let's catch a few more.
We talked about the Greenpeace overlays. But I'm going to pass it back to you, so I don't
save the butterfly.
I don't get sacrificed by the Greenpeace and the vegans out there.
The Greenpeace overlays, and the greenies of the world, the floras and faunas, the biodiversity, the koalas, and save the butterfly, save the moth, overlays. I hate them with passion.
Not that you hate koalas.
No. I love koalas. I love butterflies. I don't love moths, but it's some of these are quite interesting when it comes to save the frog and a particular species of the frog, because they lay there, and you have to be careful of how some of these things work.
You have to get a special frog person to actually come and do an assessment and a report. But you think about it, that
you need a degree for that.
You need a degree for it, yes. And actually that person was born, and that was the purpose in their life, to be the frog specialist for this exact.
I don't envy the job, Cheryl.
No, but they love frogs, right? I mean, this is what they're born for.
Yes. But I don't envy the job. But look, I mean, these do exist. Unfortunately, they do, and you need to be very, very careful, because the Greenpeace lovers of the world or of Australia would definitely make your life a living misery if you decide to, should I say, go arms in, against the butterflies or the frogs or the moths of those particular areas, or koalas, the beautiful koalas.
Not the mosses, the moths. And, I'm going to challenge there a little bit as well, because I do love my flora and fauna. I personally have looked at sites which I'm like, this is a great spot, but there are too many trees and I don't want to touch it. That's my thing. I respect that there are areas where we need to preserve the flora and fauna that are there, but then there are some areas that you sort of go, I've never seen a koala here for like 30 years or whichever, and there's some that are quite blatantly obvious. I like to say they're obvious that there is no special flora and fauna, but I guess the whole point is that you've got to go through that process and make sure that you tick all the boxes and so on. And again, there is someone out there who is a frog specialist who
would come out and give you a letter. Yes. I think that's a good segue to, some of the very important ones around the heritage listings, right? And so the cultural heritage listing. I think there are two types of heritage listings. One, where you're protecting the type of the property that is there, and so you can't change the facade at all, and you keep it as is. And then there are heritage listings or heritage overlays in relation to the Aboriginals and the elders of the world, where they used to live there and practice there, and you have to reach out to elder or a community person to come in and ensure that the site does not have any of those. And I respect those. I think that's very, very important to ensure that you're not side cutting and find some remains or some family was living there, etc.
Bad juju in the development projects of no.
100%. I tend to stay away from cultural heritages or heritage overlays as a rule in general. I don't know. I think everyone has their own preferences. There are developers who, like working in those areas and, are okay with, seeking these reports and getting someone out there. I always feel that, there needs to be some sort of respect to some of these areas. They used to live here hundreds of years ago. And of course, you are tampering away with, people who used to live here and, who might have passed away and, are buried there. And so, I'm a very sort of, should I say, sensitive about some of these things, that, you shouldn't be touching some of these things.
If it's a butterfly, what's this like? That's it.
Yes. I think the soul for the butterfly, I'm not so much scared of, but the soul of a person or a human, I'm definitely scared of.
Might have been reincarnated into a butterfly. That's if you believe in reincarnation.
Yeah, a fat butterfly, yes.
It is one of those things. I'm in Aboriginal elders getting reports to be able to say and to identify whether there are artifacts or remains. I think that's a really big thing, and just to be able to respect that culturally, I think that is a personally as a developer, I think that's a really important thing to do.
Definitely. I think I'm going to wrap this up with one statement that I wrote when I was thinking about doing this podcast, and this is more about when it comes to property development, it's never as bad as what they say, but it's also not as good as they say, right? So get yourself in there and just do your bloody due diligence yourself, right? Just don't trust and believe others.
Yeah, and don't get stuck on it too much as well. If you've done enough and there is a certain level of there is enough, then and you feel that you've ticked as much of the boxes as you can, it's important to also take action. So don't suffer from paralysis analysis. If you're not doing too little and you're doing, sufficient, then sometimes you do have to be able to keep moving forward. And there's all going to be a whole lot of surprises along the way anyhow.
Yes. Now, every development, brings in its own challenges, and there is always a solution for every problem. That's what I've always felt when it comes to property development. You just need to be super creative about how you go around finding these solutions, and the person who finds the best solution makes the most money.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Moss. Not Moss.
Thank you.
Moss. We like Moss.
Let's wrap this up.
Like
Thank
Moss.
you very much. Hopefully you had a lot of fun similar to what we did. Look, if you like the content, feel free to drop in and share some of your stories in relation to the due diligence side of things or property development side of things. Haters, likers, subscribers, thank you for listening to us. Stay safe, keep investing, keep smiling. This is Moss and Cheryl checking out
Ciao,
Adios.
ciao. Bye-bye.